Hello, everyone. This is Tenzin from Women's March Global.
And I'm Katie from Women's March Global.
This week, we released our fourth of 5 actions to end violence against women. And it's called Our Community. It's a mini course in partnership with our global chapters. Through this mini course, we hope to make visible the issues that women face around the world and also emphasize that women's experiences are not isolated. Our global chapters will be sharing their experiences and the grassroots actions they are taking to advance women's rights in their communities. Each week, we'll be in conversation with the chapter ambassador from a local chapter. Today, we have Natarsia from Women's March Harare, Zimbabwe, with us. Hi, Natarsia. We're so glad to
Hi,
have you join us.
thank you for having me.
If you have any questions for Natarsia, please feel free to put them in the comment box below. We'll be going through them towards the end of the webinar. So just to start off, Natarsia, can you tell us a little bit about how you became involved with Women's March Global and why you decided to start a chapter in Harare?
Awesome. Okay, so initially I got to know about Women's March through a friend who's a chapter ambassador for Women's March, Johannesburg. So I got to talk to them about how they'd actually joined the movement, and I got really interested, and they actually encouraged me to message Women's March Global and then make an application to start our own chapter in Harare.
Great.
Okay. So we're going to switch back and forth. So can you tell us, you recently held an event in response to the violence against women perpetrated around the elections in Zimbabwe. Can you tell us more about that event and more about the context of what was going on?
Okay, so around January this year, there was an outbreak of violent protests, especially in reaction to the president announcing an increase in fuel prices. So that became a matchstick to issues that had been going on for a while that people were quiet about. But then the unfortunate thing is that women, as in any conflict situation, were more on the receiving end of the violence that actually was now let out on the civilians. So you would see that in instances where soldiers would raid houses, women would be beaten and they would be more vulnerable than their male counterparts. And there were actually videos that were being circulated which actually supported that in essence, the army was actually responsible for violence against women's bodies. And also there were other reports about women actually being raped during the suppression of these incidences. So what happened was that not many women actually came up front and actually said, I was raped because of fear, maybe of being singled out, and then, maybe you don't know what happens after. But then there are reports which actually support the fact that there are women who were raped, especially in peri-urban areas. So as Women's March Harare, we decided to have a conversation around, how safe are women, how safe women are in instances where, rule of law is suspended. Because if you're having a situation where the soldiers are raping people and there's no war happening, what more in a conflict situation where you actually have rebels or, the government against maybe a group that is uprising. So the conversation actually brought out, points that would make you really wonder where we are at in terms of achieving women's rights. Because you would see that even the ones who stood up about the rape issues, the women who stood up for other women, were actually scared for their own safety. So then defeats the whole purpose of activism. If the people who are on the forefront of the activist movement are afraid of their own safety, then it it just then means that maybe in instances where we are supposed to have like a vibrant activist movement, it might not be as active as we would want it to be.
So it sort of it was a discussion around the violence that was happening, but how that's sort of quelling in some ways the activist movement, because women feel that if they say anything, they're more vulnerable than perhaps they even were before then.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so was it just the military that was perpetuating this violence, or did it spread to civilians doing that as well? Or no, it was just the military mostly?
It was just, reports say it was just the military.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because they are the ones who have the military muscles. It wasn't really between civilians and civilians. It was the military against the civilians.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I think the thing that really, sparked public outrage is that instead of our justice system actually doing something about it, the issue was swept under the rug.
I see. So,
yeah.
So theoretically, the justice branch of the government would bring people to trial or hold the military accountable for these actions, but that didn't happen at all.
Yes. Yeah. It was more lip service where they would say, oh, if you've been raped, come up front. But we know that if you come up front, you're going to serve as an example for other people. So no one would really come up front.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So in your conversation that you all had, were there any discussions or thinking around what actions could be taken? Was there any sort of ideas about how you might pressure for some sort of change, either within law enforcement or the government? Was there any discussion around that?
Yes, it was. And I think one of the most echoed sentiment was, instead of only going on the street, because obviously going on the street doesn't work in this country, we could make use of other mediums which have actually proven to work, like social media. Most of these marches and demonstrations are actually starting on social media. And see, if you notice, around January we had a social media shutdown.
Yeah.
So we're just thinking, you know what, maybe we could keep on pressuring, change, and making noise so that we are heard through mediums such as social media. And also maybe we had an author amongst the panelists who was actually saying, you know what, we could actually document these stories. And make sure that the whole world gets to know. Because if they're going to shut down social media, they haven't shut down our pens and our papers. So we will still document, we will still write.
Right.
And we'll make sure that word gets out there. But then it also comes back to making sure that whatever little action you're doing, it might not be to the greatest magnitude, but just making sure that you're a sister's keeper. Whatever little action that you're doing, it accounts to something.
Yeah. I really like that. I mean, I think, we here at Women's March Global believe that these small actions really do matter. It sometimes feels in the moment that maybe a little hopeless, or that it's like a drop in an ocean. And so how can it really matter? But I think that it does. And it sounds like, at your talk, you all really rallied around the idea that you need to keep pushing forward, even if it feels a little overwhelming sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
We talked about the elections and what happened in terms of the violence against women, and also your event. Can you talk about the recent situation right now in the country, and also maybe in your local community, in terms of women's rights, and how do you think this is going to go?
Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, we still have a long way to go. I mean, much has been done, from women not being allowed to wear trousers to now women, can wear trousers, but we still have the issue of culture. Zimbabwe has the statutory law side of it and the customary law side of it. And we have most of our population in rural areas where the customary law is more practiced than the statutory. So that there are bits and pieces of our culture which still have, rules and norms that discriminate against women. And you find that that's where now the most population of the country is in. So we still need to push, because of late we're still struggling with child marriages. Where you find that there's the constitution doesn't support for that, but then in instances where the customary law is quiet or silent about it, you find out that we've got around 30% of children being married into child marriages under the age of 18. So in as much as there are laws which protect women and young women, sometimes it becomes hard to implement them where the culture and the religion speaks to support violence against women. And in some instances we have laws such as the Domestic Violence Act, which is there, it's there in paper, but when you go to the actual police station, you find out that when women report their husbands for physical abuse, a few days later they come back and they withdraw the case, because it all then comes back to what the society will say about you if you're that woman who had her husband arrested, or if you're that woman who can't take care of herself financially, who's dependent on the husband. So it's around how, I think in Zimbabwe the problem is that as we have laws that protect women, the implementation bit is lagging because of our culture, because of the religion, and societal pressures and norms, especially what's expected of a woman in our context.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty global issue, right? Yeah. I mean, it manifests differently in different cultures and different countries, but yeah, I mean, there are these laws, right? So the law says that this should not happen, or that people should be treated equally, but then people don't report it because in their own communities they think it's fine, right? That this is happening. Or when women do report it, there's a backlash. There's more of a risk of reporting than just staying in the situation almost sometimes.
So we have a question for you from our comment box. It's from Uma, and the question is, do you see men getting involved in the conversation in support of women?
I'll speak from the recent event that we had. We actually invited male participants into the space because we wanted to hear what they thought in terms of protecting, women in conflict situations. And I think there is room to involve men in these discussions, because women do not live in isolation from these men. And sometimes, especially with patriarchy, some men are just conditioned to think that they are more important or superior than women. And we need to deconstruct those harmful, paradigms, which then lead to a culture of violence. So there is room to involve men, and it might not yield results now, but we just need to keep on pushing. We need to open up our spaces, and we might actually get to where we want to get.
Yeah, I think what you said is so important, that we don't live in isolation from men, and in fact it's impossible to do so. I mean, maybe not impossible, but highly unlikely, and therefore we need to think of ways to bring men into the conversation in a way that's productive and a way that's deconstructing these patriarchal narratives, as you said. I mean, I think that's so important, because until men start thinking differently about how they're treating women, they're likely not going to change their behavior, right? No matter how much we push or are frustrated by it and express that frustration. Yeah.
Because I could actually give an example of our parliament. The majority of the seats are held by men. So if you want to push a motion, you need to have those men on your side. So if we then exclude them from women's discussions, the moment you take your position paper to parliament, it will be tossed out because they don't understand where we are coming from and where we want to go. So there is need for us to involve men in our discussions.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just to end things off, part of what inspired us to create this campaign and the mini course webinar series is to give the global chapters the opportunity to kind of engage in dialogue with each other, and also share stories across borders with the global community. And so to finish off, what message do you want to send to our global community who are watching this right now?
Okay, I've got a mouthful to say.
Just to put you on the spot.
I would just, encourage, other global communities to keep pushing, because we might not see the results we want to see now, but we just need to keep pushing, because it's also about giving hope to the other generations that are coming after us.
Yeah.
That, in as much as we might not experience the fruits of our labor now, at least let's do it for them. Let's make sure that by the time the next generation is in power, we have more women in parliament. But by the time the next generation is all grown up and ready to lead the movement forward, they should expect backlash, and they should have the spirit of fighting.
Yeah. No, that's really beautiful. Thank you so much. So great to have you and to talk to you. And
it was great to talk to you too.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and also starting off this month's mini course series, which is the fourth of 5 actions to end gender-based violence. So we're so glad to have you.
Yeah, and everybody have a good day.
Yeah, also, just a quick note, next week we'll be in conversation with Women's March Sydney and learn the actions they're taking to advance women's rights in their country and communities. So we hope to see you there, and also follow the link in the comment box to sign up. And thank you so much for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.